But what about imported products that contain GM material? They're limited as well, I believe, aren't they?
Well, into Europe, you mean?
Yes.
The European Union has approved a number of the so-called events. Each genetic manipulation is described as an event. So, for example, the one which confers insect resistance is called an event. Now, you can then move that event into a series of subsidiary strains for growing in different environmental conditions, but that still remains the same event, and you have permission for that event. So there are a number of events, these so-called events, which are approved for import as food into Europe, including soya and maize, but not the range of oilseed rape which would allow them to import Canadian canola. I think because Canadian canola tends to be a mix, and only some of them are approved in Europe. In particular, sugar beet is not approved in Europe, whereas the Americans shifted with it a few years ago to GM sugar beet, and within 2 years it was 95% GM. I mean, it's just amazing. You asked what benefit it was, everyone. Well, American farmers, to the extent of 95% of the sugar beet farmers, in 2 years decided it was worth moving.
And what was the characteristic that was the benefit in this?
It was a weed control.
Weed control. So it reduced their weed control usage of
Weeds
chemicals.
are an awful nuisance of sugar beet. Sugar beet's a low plant on the ground,
Yeah.
and very difficult indeed. And incidentally, while it occurs to me, it's worth mentioning the question of tilling, a question of no-till agriculture. You know, people, perhaps I ought to explain that for people like myself. I'm a Londoner, and what I knew about agriculture most of my life was not very much. But I knew that farmers ploughed the ground. Wasn't altogether sure why they ploughed the ground, but I knew they did it. That's one of the things that farmers do. So I had a farmer friend at one stage, and I asked him, well, why do farmers plough? And he said, well, there are really two reasons. One of them is to aerate the soil, break up the chunks or whatever. And you need to do that, he said, every few years. He said 10 or whatever it was, every few years. And the other reason, he said, was before there was any effective means of weed control, by ploughing, you drop the weed deeply down into the soil so the seeds couldn't germinate. So it's a primitive form of weed control. But if you have better forms of weed control, you don't really need to do it. And of course, ploughing is very destructive. It destroys the soil structure, kills all the animals. You have to drive tractors up and down, so it uses machines and fuel and carbon dioxide and compacts the ground and takes time. Everything is against ploughing except farmers do it. The organic farmers do it as a religion almost. And so what you can now do is you do not need to clear the rubble from last year's crop. You simply punch a hole and drop a seed in it, because the weed killers will take care of the weed next year if your crops are weed killer resistant. So that produces what's called no-till agriculture. Very beneficial environmentally, if you want to use that term. Very commercially effective because it cuts labour and material costs, and it works.
And that was begun with ICI, with paraquat. That was the first.
It was not
no-till.
a totally new thing to have no-till, but it's become much easier with some of these GM plants because of the characteristic of the plant. So it is a great benefit to do that.
So does that change in technology, does it actually produce higher yields and reduce pesticide use?
Well, there are, when you talk about higher yields, you really two ways of looking at this. Is the plant intrinsically more capable of producing greater yield? Not yet. They have not produced yet plants which will do that. But do plants suffer less loss because of pests in the field? Yes, indeed. That's why they're so advantageous to farmers. So the yields go up not because the plants are better, but because you let them produce the maximum they're capable of, rather than getting the insects and the weeds to take some of it away. So yes, and people have done calculations about this and shown worked out how much benefit farmers in various areas have had from this. Poor countries and rich countries both.
But is it an aim in GM technology to improve yields as such?
Yes, but that's a more difficult sort of thing to do. After all, these early techniques of weed killer resistant and insect resistant are actually very simple genetic modification. They're all both single genes. And Remember, that's 30 years ago that this was started. It took 15 years roughly to get it into the field. If it takes that long to do a simple one, it's not easy to do these things. It's not easy to find out just what it is that limits a plant's productivity, and producing a technique which will improve that, and then getting it actually developed and in place and regulated and developed and marketed. So I think it'll happen, but these things don't happen immediately.
And what about, is pesticide use actually reduced? Are there statistics to show that this is that it does reduce their usage?
In the case of the BT, that's the toxin, the gene which produces a bacterial toxin which kills the insects. I'll talk about that in a minute. Yes, that there has been an enormous reduction in the use of pesticide in those cases. I said something like 80%, I remember, in China, for example. So a very large reduction. Now, the toxin itself is produced by a soil bacterium called Bacillus thuringiensis, which is hence the BT, and it has been on sale in garden centres for a long time, and indeed it is used by organic farmers as a spray because it is organic, and so that's okay. However, the organic movement says if you put the very same thing inside the plant in the form of a gene, then we're not allowed to use it. So there is an interesting thought process going on there. But nevertheless, it's not toxic to humans or to mammals. It's only toxic to lepidopteran insects, and indeed it's only toxic to those insects which bite into the plant. So normally when you use insecticides to control insects, you have to spray around, and of course you can't spray per insect, so other insects get zapped as well. Whereas in this case, you're only killing those insects which attack the plant, the very insects, and only the very insects that you want to kill.
But presumably they have predators in some point, so if they are killed off, does that affect the sort of the line of...
I'm sure it does, because biology is like that, yes, that's right. The system will readjust in some way.
And so there will be some changes in the insect population
sure
and the bird population.
Who knows? Who knows how
but
far...
Surely if we've been going that long, we should know that by now.
We should know, but on the other hand, you could then ask the question that, except for the local scene, how important are these insects in the ecological chain? And the answer is I don't know.
They're not necessarily as important as bees, for instance.
No. Well, they're not doing what bees do,
Yeah.
so they are different sorts of...
But so the increase in it's been an incredible uptake in GM crops.
Yes.
What's the sort of rate of increase over the years?
Well, it's been about 10%. That's to say, in terms of area planted, since it started in 95, 96-ish, it's been running at the rate of 10 to 20% increase per year, compounded.
And that's in both large and small farmers? That's the sort of...
Large and small farms and rich and poor countries. It started in the rich countries. It started predominantly in the US, Canada, and then they went to South America, but since then it's been going to lots of poor countries. It's now getting into Africa, Southeast Asia. So the poor farmers and the small farmers, it's not a scale question. You don't have to be a large farmer with a big financial capacity in order to make use of it. Small farmers can do it. But there is a problem with very poor farmers in some places, and that is they don't have any money at all and they can't get started.
How do they get access to seed?
How do they get access? I think they have to have some form of handout.
And does this happen anywhere at the
Yes,
moment?
yes, otherwise they wouldn't get started. In fact, they do get started, and this, one could argue, is one of the important aspects of aid that countries like ours could become involved in, is to help small farmers, poor farmers in those countries to get started in this technology by giving them the starter packs that they need. You know, once they're on and rolling, then they get some money from the first year, and with luck that'll help them on the second year.
Would the large-scale companies that own the rights to these seeds, would they agree to that?
The large-scale companies, as you say, that own the rights are really not interested in what happens in countries where they can't sell because nobody's got any money. So they are happy that their technology can be given away to those countries, and it doesn't even need to be, because many of those countries can develop their own anyway. So India and China and Mexico and, as I said, Philippines and places like that do it. Or we could do it and give it away.
as part of our food aid.
Part of our food aid and our public sector
aid.
Sure.
Yeah. So you've illustrated there's a huge amount of acceptance to GM crops around the world, but we come to Europe,
Yes.
and there is still considerable opposition,
Yes.
both to growing and eating GM food.
Yeah.
I think there are two things that worry people, two of the main things. One is the effect on human health of GM food, and the other is on the environmental effects. But are there any other reasons for the problems in the European market?
Well, I think there are problems, and one of the problems is commercial interest. I think there are, and we can talk about that, but you might put it on your list of things that we should talk about as far as Europe is concerned, as to why people in Europe are antipathetic. To the extent they are, not everybody, of course, is antipathetic, but some people are. I wouldn't like to put a number on it as to what proportion are, but a significant number of people in Europe, as you say, are antipathetic, and one might well ask why, since it works.
You must have a reason.
Well, I'm a scientist. I'm a biological scientist, not a sociologist, and so my reasons are all second-hand from other people. But
what do they say?
Okay, well, some people are genuinely afraid that it is dangerous, personally dangerous to them in a medical sense, and they are fed stories by the popular press and by those who have an interest in circulating such stories that there is danger, and every now and again there are some very odd scientific, pseudo-scientific, some people would say, publication has come out apparently supporting that point of view, although such publications tend to get very short shrift from the scientific community.
I believe there was a trial in France recently with some rats which showed that these rats developed tumours.
There was indeed. Do you want me to enlarge upon that?
Perhaps you could explain what it was about.
Yes, the trial, the justification for the trial the experiment was that, according to the authors, which was actually not true, that most trials, feeding trials with rats of herbicide-tolerant maize, I think it was, and Roundup had been short-term, 90 days. And this was unreasonable because things might happen longer than 90 days. It might take longer for adverse symptoms or whatever to show up. So they ran 2-year trials, so they said these were the first. Actually, they were not the first, other people had done it before. And they chose a strain of rat which was the same, or nearly the same, not clear that it was absolutely the same, as that used by Monsanto as partly justification for what they did. But one of the problems that they appeared not to have realised, or perhaps they realised and decided not to do anything about it, was those rats, that strain of rats spontaneously develops tumours by 2 years old. And so it was going to be very difficult to decide, if they were to find tumours, whether the tumours were spontaneous ones, which those rats developed anyway, or were due to the diet they were feeding them. And so it has turned out. So whereas the experimenters in France claimed that the tumours they saw were the results of experiments, everybody else says they were not. Or at least you can't tell, because these rats got tumours anyway, and they didn't run enough controls in order to separate out spontaneous from experimental effects. The statistics were rubbish, they said. And so everybody has, except the people who did it and their political supporters, have rubbished the experiments, including all the 6 academies of science in France itself said the experiments were no good. Academies of science all around the world and regulatory agencies, everybody said the experiment did not show what the people said it showed. And yet, of course, the newspapers, minded to do so, ran headlines, but then they do.
But then they had the story first before the
well, indeed, that was
scientific advice came out.
Well, that was another thing which perhaps is worth mentioning, is that when people have interesting scientific data to put out, which they wish the journalists to know about, they may well put it out under embargo. That's to say, the journalists have a deadline after which they may use it and not before. But the journalists are not prevented from consulting scientists about the information which they're being given. In this case, they were. And that meant that the journalists who wrote the story had had no opportunity of consulting anybody else. And what the effect of that was that the French data got a splash, which is the way they intended it. This was regarded as being highly immoral and unethical by those who didn't approve.
How can we be sure that there won't be another sort of BSE type thing from genetically modified cross? I mean, that BSE, which caused CJD in humans, came about, I believe, because cows were fed animal proteins and their digestive system isn't geared to deal with animal protein. So there was a rogue protein, a prion, which developed, which wasn't transferable to humans.
Yes,
and it took a long time to develop.
Yes, I think that wasn't quite what the reason was. The reason was that the previous method of processing the meat got rid of the prion, and then at some stage they changed the regulations and the new technology no longer got rid of the prion. That's what the problem was. But anyhow, the effect was that it was fed to...
But the animal protein fed to cows still caused the development of the prion.
Apparently, although there is still some argument about it, but apparently that was it. How does one know that something...
Something like that couldn't happen again?
Well, something untoward, not necessarily. Well, you don't, of course. The future is unknown to us. And so there's no point in pretending that you know what the future is. And we might at this point make a comment about what we mean when we say something is safe, because that's something that people like to say. Prove that it's safe, they will say. Now, if you consider what safe and safety mean, and it's worth looking up the dictionary about this, safe and safety always are defined negatively. Safety, say something is safe if it is not harmful. If there is no danger or harm attached to it, then something is said to be safe. And that, you notice, is a negative criterion. I would challenge you to define safe positively. Do you think you could do it?
I know, I don't think so.
I think you probably could. Now, as you know, negative propositions cannot be proven. You can never prove that something is not, only that something is. So you say something is not dangerous, it's not dangerous, it's not dangerous, and then you find out that it is dangerous. So it's always possible, if you don't know the future, not to know something is dangerous, because all you have is the evidence that it's safe. So safety depends only on its behaviour so far. So if there has been no danger so far, something is safe. But we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. All sorts of things might happen tomorrow. You know, air travel is safe, but the aeroplane you fly in might crash tomorrow.
But as far as we know... There are no adverse signs at the moment.
As far as we know. And it has been going on now. People have been eating this stuff. Been eating some examples of it, because, you know, when one talks about GM, you're not talking about everything, you're talking about a few cases of material. But people have been eating those products now since 1995, and there hasn't been a single authenticated case of medical harm to anybody. And you can work out how many meals people have had which have contained. In fact, I came across a very interesting piece of information which I must share with you because it's so good. And I found this out only this morning by chance when I was fiddling, as I often do, on the internet, and I came across a piece of information from the Wellcome Trust. And I wonder if I can ask you a question. You know that when you eat food, you eat the whole content, salads and fruit and whatever, but also true for other food. You eat the cells, and the cells contain DNA, so you eat DNA. And you know that DNA is a very long molecule, but extremely thin, and so you can pack a long length of it into a very small space. When you have a meal, what aggregate length of DNA do you suppose you're eating?
Absolutely no idea.
No idea at all?
No.
What do you think? An inch or a yard or a...